And thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar on social capital. You will have the ability today to really go through a in-depth step-by-step process of social capital and how that is important and plays a role in the sustainability of your organization. We have a great lineup of case studies and an amazing presenter here for you today. But before we do jump into the webinar, I wanted to read a message from our sponsor, KindSight. KindSight is the combination of iWave, UC Innovation, and Nonprofit OS delivers what has never been possible before: fundraising intelligence that empowers nonprofits and advancement professionals to have the right conversations with the right donors at the right time. Every time. This solution combines big data, AI, and automation to power modern fundraising. So thank you again, KindSight, for being the sponsor for today's webinar. And I'd like to take a second to introduce you to our moderators for today. We have Dana Brito and Wade Rogers, who will be moderating the webinar today. They will be moderating not only in our chat, but also doing Q&As live during our webinar. Inside the chat, please ask any questions that you may have, either if there are questions that you had posted during registration or questions that come up during the presentation. And our moderators will be in the chat helping you to either answer those questions or bringing them to the presenters during the webinar. But also, please feel free to answer each other's questions in the chat. That is a big part of our webinars. We love to see the engagement between participants. Thank you. And I'd also like to just introduce you to our presenters for today. We have Elizabeth Castillo, who is Assistant Professor of Sustainable Management from California State University in San Bernardino, who will be doing the majority of the step-by-step presentation for you today. She is an expert in this field and will be helping you to get a better understanding of social capital. And we also have an interview from Jeanne Larsen, who is Executive Director of Northern Dental Access Center. She was not able to join us for the webinar today, but we do have a recording of the interview with Jeanne. And then we have Stephanie Moore, Executive Director of the Center for Craft in North Carolina, who will be giving you a detailed case study, one on her personal story of how social capital has helped her. And now I'm going to pass it over to Ruth McCambridge.
Hi. Thank you very much for being here today. This is a topic that's very close to my heart, mostly because I have lived through it any number of times. Today, we're going to be taking up the topic of social capital, what it is, how it gets used, what are its dynamics, how can you make sure that it works for your organization and your community sustainability. I will say, and before we get started, I want to say that what brought us to this topic is really, we came at it in a very organic way. When we first started the Nonprofit Financial Commons, it was during the pandemic. And one of the things that we thought to do during that time, among the other ways that we tried to get information about what nonprofits were thinking about financially, was we thought, let's do a set of case studies that allows us to just look over people's shoulders in terms of how they were responding to the serious financial questions that were generated by the pandemic. And just about every every nonprofit had them, some much more intensely than others, obviously, but everybody had some form of them. And what we found in that process, I did those case studies, and essentially I sat with nonprofit leaders, groups of leaders, sometimes 7, 8, 9 people at a time, who I would just ask them what happened and how did you respond. I was expecting to get a financial answer. I didn't get a financial answer. And so what I got was what we all do when we're faced with these kinds of situations. It is not written down anywhere, really, in terms of it being a best practice. But it has everything to do with not only our sustainability, but our ability to grow and develop even with kind of the periodic periods of crisis that we always experience. No nonprofit is going to get through 20 years without experiencing some crisis unless you're in an extraordinary position. And for a lot of nonprofits, any downturn in the economy, any immediate kind of fiscal disaster like a hurricane or some other weather event is going to affect you deeply. And it's going to affect your funding, and it's going to affect the need that people have, and make more calls on what it is that you need to do. What I found when I went to talk with these 7 organizations, which ranged from everything from a very high profile arts organization to very, very local direct service organizations to Catholic charity groups. Same story every single time, which was we stood back for a minute, we were confused ourselves. And then we started looking around us to see what needs were developing. We took that all in. And then we began to call every single friend or contact every single friend that we could think of to let them know what was going on. Not that we had any answers that we needed to direct them to yet, but just because we wanted them to be sure to have a way to connect with us in the middle of all of that. So and then what people did was that they started to organize those partners, those networks, and some of them were very close in, some of them were more national. Those networks did a number of things. Number one, they pulled in around the organization to try to answer some of the immediate resource questions that organization might have, but it also it fed the organization huge amounts of information about what was going on in the community and how other people had responded to similar kinds of issues, etc. So what we found was that, in fact, most of these organizations did not mobilize immediately around financial problem solving at all. What they organized around was what are we likely to see in terms of the community need, and who needs to know about this and who needs to be by our side at this moment. What I think every single one of them found was that they were able to access the human and social capital that they needed to bring financial capital towards them. And this gets to the general, kind of diagram of how social capital works. Social capital, thankfully, it's not spendable. It's wastable, like you can lose it, but it's not spendable in that if I spend this, I will have no more. That's not the way social capital works. It's very regenerative. And it's built on the backs of a number of other kinds of capital. But essentially, central in the way social capital works is that it builds your place in community. It builds your leadership place in community. And once that leadership place is built and your reputation is there and it's been tested and trust has been established, people will depend on you to manage things that may be far beyond the numbers of dollars that you've managed before, or the size of organization that you've managed before. So these kinds of crises, and this happens in all kinds of organizations, these kinds of crises actually can be used to almost as a counter-cyclical thing, that you don't actually necessarily lose money during these periods, but you end up building your resource threads more strongly during these periods. So it's a very weird dynamic, but it's one that a lot of nonprofits are very good at. I want to say that one of the things that makes me know this is that, yes, I did these 7 case studies. Maybe they were a weird 7 organizations. But as soon as I heard about what had happened in Asheville, as we were in North Carolina, as we were getting ready to do um, this webinar, I asked Wade if he would let me know if there was any nonprofit around him that was fitting this mold in terms of the story that was being told. And he knew immediately of more than one. And luckily we have one with us today, in the person of Stephanie Moore, who works with the Center for Craft. So what's important about this is that this process of really depending upon the social capital around you is absolutely critical to your sustainability as a nonprofit organization. We exist for a different purpose. It is not to build profit, it's to build strength among our constituencies in various kinds of ways. And that's kind of a broad brush, but that's essentially what we are here to do, and to build strength between and among people, as well as in individual people. And that builds also strength in and around us. And it allows us to do more as time moves on. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's not at all. And you're going to hear all about that today. But these, as we're headed into the election, especially right now, I want to say that these kinds of crises, they're terrifying, and yet they can be used to help you exhibit what you really have at your fingertips, which is an incredible number of relationships and all of the resources that those relationships bring with them. So with that, I'm going to skip over the next slide. We may come back to it later. This is the forms of social capital. And we'll put this in your resource list, but I want to make sure that we have all of the time that we need for, I think I have a couple more minutes. So let me talk about these forms of capital. These are the forms that build upon each other. So every nonprofit functions with these kinds of capital. Social capital is that your networks, your extended networks, they may be local, some of them may be national, but you have multiple networks of stakeholders. Cultural capital it's kind of in your organization almost as a credibility measure. It's manifested through the knowledge that you hold together about who you are. Economic capital is obviously the financial capital that comes towards us when we've exhibited the other 2 kinds of capital. And symbolic capital is where the conversion happens. That's when people really understand your identity vis-a-vis your community and your capability vis-a-vis your community. I do want to say that this stuff is largely invisible in terms of the way we talk about nonprofits. We don't talk about the nonprofits necessarily as having a huge amount of social capital that's there to be converted into financial capital. That's not the way we talk. But we do know that if a huge group in our community and very different kinds of stakeholders come together to say this particular domestic violence program is absolutely crucial to everything that's done in this community, that is going to result in financial capital and reputational capital. So it's these things are all interconnected. They build one upon the other. They very often will develop kind of in a smooth conversion one to another over time. But when crises like this happen, they can convert very quickly into something extremely different looking. So that's why we chose to do this particular session today, because we feel like we are coming up on a period of some disruption, probably in the country, if not politically, which pretty sure that we're guessing right. There will be some disruption in that area, but we're seeing more and more weather events and other kinds of if there's an economic downturn, a recession, etc., all affects us in the same way as far as these kinds of stories are concerned. So we would love it if you, as the participants in this session, would let us know whether any of this resonates, and whether the language that we're using on this is troublesome for you, if you recognize your own story in this. We'd love it if you would feed back to us and ask any questions that you have on our way through all of this. And with that, I'm going to move to an interview that I did with Jeanne Larsen. It is extremely dramatic. The pandemic had a huge effect on what they were able to do, and it had everything to do with how they handled their social capital at the moment that all hit. So Jeanne Larsen is the executive director and one of the founders of the Northern Dental Access Center in rural Minnesota. Hi, Jeanne. It's so nice to see you again.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, Jeanne, this is a webinar about social capital, and what I wanted to do was to really start just with the story of your organization's emergence. How did the dental center get started? Can you describe what it is now, very short form, and then describe what it took to actually get it started? Because that is a epic story.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It really is one of the most rewarding things I've ever been involved in my career. So Northern Dental Access Center, as of now, is a series of dental clinics in rural northern Minnesota, and we serve low-income children and families with dental care, mostly the Medicaid enrolled population, and that is who we were designed to serve as a nonprofit organization. And our origin story comes from the scarcity model in rural Minnesota, where there just wasn't anybody, any one entity that really could address what we were seeing was generations of lack of access to dental care in our community. And a number of concerns across all sectors were really saying something's got to be done. Somebody has to do something about it. But there was no large hospital, no big enough university, no big nonprofit, no large philanthropic organization that could really take that on. And so our origin story comes from long before we even opened the clinic, 6 years of community stakeholder planning and strategic development, wherein across 30 some sectors, we had people meeting twice a month over their lunch, nonstop, to plan and design something that might be sustainable long-term. And in those 6 years, we had dentists and pharmacists and physicians and school nurses and all of the health and human service folks and the law enforcement and everybody who was saying, and employers, you cannot access dental care and our public health is suffering. And during that planning, it became clear that we can only do this if we all pitch in and we all find common ground, common language, a common vision. Some folks got dissatisfied. They wanted a certain thing and others wanted a certain thing, but we focused on what we could agree on. And what we could agree on was a dental center that not only served those folks in need, but understood the complexities of poverty and how together we can also address barriers, because social determinants of health, we know access to care is still only about 10% of the problem. There's a whole bunch of other barriers. So
Right.
we created this miracle of no wrong door interaction community-wide on how to help people get access to dental care and help people who entered the dental clinic to get access to the support services. And dentists, private dentists, were on the edges of that conversation for those years, skeptical. Back in that time, this is the early 2000s, there wasn't the shortage we're quite seeing now. And they were like, you know, we can handle it. If the state just paid us a little more, we would be fine. We don't really need you. But luckily, they decided to not get in our way and sat back patiently and waited. And then within 6 years, we raised enough money to open on a small scale. And that just took off because the need became so crushing, and we just grew and grew and grew. It's like a flywheel effect if you read Jim Collins, right? We just grew and grew. And so over the course of 15 years, we started with 2,000 patient encounters, and we're now at 30,000 patient encounters. That's how big we've become, all because of the support across multiple sectors.
Right.
And the cool thing is, we opened our first clinic in 1 month. The bottom fell out of the economy in February of 2009. So we grew up literally this organization in poverty, and we learned how to rely on each other to withstand all of the obstacles that were put in our way, in the same way that our patients have learned to withstand them. So it's really been a fun ride.
Right. Fun. That exhausting perhaps, but really, yeah, it has produced for sure.
For
Can
sure.
you talk a little bit, because this is where we entered with you, right? Can you talk a little bit about what happened during the pandemic? Because that was a kind of a miracle story in itself.
It really was. It was probably the most frightening time that I remember as an administrator, in those early days when we didn't know how the virus was even being transmitted. And we didn't realize that others could make decisions for us as an agency. And because we felt we were essential, we just kept going. And then within a few days, the Board of Dentistry shut every dental clinic down. And so no dental practice, public or private, was allowed to serve patients. And then within a few days, they said, well, you can only do emergencies. And then they had a definition of emergencies. And then the sector basically all just went home. And, you know, with the volume of patients that we're seeing, there are plenty of emergencies just to keep us going. So we slowly brought a few folks back and a few dentists back, but what we found was the private sector saying, we don't have enough emergencies, you know, to bring our people back. And by the way, a lot of rural dentists fell within the age category where they felt personally at risk for COVID. So we had built up enough trust. I mean, because we kind of we scanned over those 12, 13 years where we were open, where we built some trust that we didn't violate any competitive advantage with the private sector. So they still were on the sidelines, but they weren't against us at all. We built that trust up. And then that sector said, could you take on our emergency patients? And so we made a bargain that said, absolutely, these are the conditions, right? They're not going to be our patients of record long-term, but for emergencies, yes, tell people to come and we will see them. And there was even another community clinic south of here that does what we do. Even they couldn't make it work. And so we took on their patients as well. And that, as it slowly built, it was just an incremental. Then the vaccine came out and dental clinics open and the Board of Dentistry loosened restrictions. So we kind of got back to normal in a very painful, drawn out way. But so here we are, you know, today, having gained even greater sort of trust and across yet another sector. And what was also cool during that time is we had built up a number of good relationships with funders and stakeholders who, when with the prospect of there being no access, not even to emergencies in this entire region, they would call me, they'd step up. What can we do? What can we do? And so emergency funding came in without hardly any, real effort on our part. But again, because we'd spent so much time building up, always over delivering on any, grants that we had in the past. And that concept of helping patients address and navigate the system was also really helpful during COVID, because the system was even harder to navigate then. And we just had staff positioned really well. And so we kind of knocked it out of the park, even though it was incredibly hard, and it was quite emotional for most of us. But looking back, I can see how much it helped us as an agency over the long term, both in how we now do our services in general, but also in that social capital building. And even now post-COVID, I'm seeing impact from that.
Right. So let me ask you just a couple of questions about, were there moments at which you could have gone in a different direction, but you kind of stuck to a more righteous path during this period? Are there choices that you made during this that you think helped you in really solidifying your social capital and your leadership position?
I certainly there were. I think one of the bigger ones was to completely, we had an essential team of staffers who we needed to stay engaged, but we could only do it a day or two at a time, again, because of the restrictions. We chose to fully pay wages and full benefits to all our team, regardless of how much they worked. And we kept all their health insurance intact, because we couldn't bring them back for 6-8 months. We kept all of their benefits intact. So we said, please stay home. Please trust us. We got you. And that was took a great deal of our operating reserves to do that. And it was a leap of faith that we could have said, and our board could have said, wow, this is more than anybody could have predicted. Everybody else is shutting down. Nonprofits were really struggling to even survive. And we could have. And we had the reserves. We had a few funders saying, please just keep it going. But in order to keep the long term in mind, we felt we had to make sure our staff felt like it was all going to be okay. And so we kept that messaging in front of them on a weekly basis, even though they were away from us for months at a time.
And when you made that decision, was your board at all skeptical about it?
No. And that's what's kind of a part of our secret sauce, is this board that is so values driven and understands that while to be patient centered requires us to be employee centered first. It's sometimes a little backwards for folks, but you know what, if we don't have this strong sense of ownership in our employees, a dedication, and do our best to remove their barriers, which is healthcare costs, childcare problems, flexibility in their scheduling, a livable, decent wage. If we don't take care of those things, they're going to be too overburdened to do this work with the focus that they need. And investing in that has never steered us wrong. And even now, we're only 16 years old. 50% of the current staff have been here for more than 5 years, right? So our retention, and 40 or 30% of them have been here more than 7 years. Our retention rate builds the continuity, that builds the efficiency, that makes sure that our patients get the care they need, and we can, we're not stifled by having to stop, retrain somebody, or lose organizational memory. That keeps us really kind of firing on all cylinders, if that makes sense. So that's been our best investment, has always been, let's whatever it takes to make the staff feel like they're going to be taken care of.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. This has been, you're one of my heroes. So
Well, you're sweet.
And Northern Dental is one of the organizations I just think about all the time as being a really great example of good practice. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And we're going to go back to the webinar.
That story was so impactful and fascinating. And maybe it resonated with you, some experiences of how your organization has gone through a crisis. And so we're going to step back and try to make sense of it through some principles regarding social capital, how it works, why it matters to organizations, and importantly, how you can develop and convert it, similar to the dental clinic did. What are some takeaways from that? And so Ruth spent some time talking about social capital. One term that we do want you to be sure to be aware of is the capital. And that's resources that endure and can create more resources. And so that's where the enduring nature of relationships comes through. And what the definition, there's no definition that everyone agrees on, but what the definition that comes through is resources that can be drawn upon. And you can think about them as a kind of potential energy and kinetic energy. And when time gets tough, then you can activate the different types of resources. And we heard it in the dental clinic story about the connections that they had established over the 7 years of planning, relationships with different types of stakeholders, the dentists, the businesses, the employees, the patients, the larger healthcare system through that social determinants of health model. And really with the focus on patient care and making it accessible to that geographic community. Those are all examples of how this ethos of putting relationships first and caring for other people as the center of the decision making. Another aspect is the importance that it be mutually beneficial interaction. So sometimes people have questions about social capital. Is it extractive? Are you trying to use people to get their resources? Not at all. In its truest sense, it is about reciprocity and making sure that the relationship is mutually beneficial, as we heard in the dental clinic stories. And the good news is, while this may feel unfamiliar because normally we don't talk about business models with this type of intangible asset, you really are probably already doing a lot of this. When you have events that are trying to meet new people, when you are taking care of your volunteers, when you are stewarding your donors, when you are training your employees and taking care of them, those are all examples of social capital development. And the beauty of this model is that it bakes capacity building into your business model and your planning, because as you're developing the capacity of other people, you're strengthening your own organization in ways that also strengthen them. And so the takeaway for today then is by approaching it more systematically and using a framework that we're going to be talking about, you can become even more intentional and have better outcomes. And the reason that this is important is that over time, with the industrialization of our society, social capital has really been put in the background, and the narrative of competition and scarcity have become the norm, and winning at all costs. Your winning has to come at my losing. But what the nonprofit sector and really civilization in general, pre-industrialization, was about relationships and cooperation. And so the nonprofit sector has a big role to play to try to re-norm relationships and relational accountability. And so social capital has different dimensions. Part of it is cognitive and psychological, the feeling of having a sense of belonging, that you belong in a group and that you're welcome, that you trust that you're going to be safe and can be your authentic self in those, shared norms and values. And you do it voluntarily. No one is coercing you. So you participate because you share those passions and values. And through this, you can build solidarity and community, as we heard with the dental case study. And then one component really important to talk about is the importance of diversity, because as we see in the next slide, how social capital works in a large part is the distribution of information. And so Jeanne told us how when nobody knew what was going on, making those phone calls, picking up, getting information, passing information along, even if they didn't know what was going to happen, to say, it's going to be okay, we're going to get through this together. Those are all sources of how social capital builds community, and creates not just benefits in the immediate interactions, but as Ruth said earlier, the symbolic capital of increasing your reputation. You're known as a go-to organization who will help people solve their problems, make their lives better. And if enough people and organizations approach exchange reciprocally like this, you end up with social cohesion. We're a society that is peaceful, that people get along together, they can count on each other. And so that's the beauty of a society rooted in a social capital approach to organization. And a metaphor that's helpful for me is Ruth said there's multiple forms of capital that need to be in place in order for the social capital to be activated and converted. And so I got my mind around it by thinking about physics, how there's different types of energy, mechanical, nuclear, radiant, electrical, and those can change forms, right? Depending on what the needs and the sources are. And very similar, the capitals can also change forms. And so, as Ruth said, and the dental clinic example showed us, is that the social capital can be drawn upon in times of need and then also be converted to financial forms of capital. And so, yes, it can be grown through intentional actions like stewardship, communication, and ethical decision making. But it can also be depleted through self-serving decision making when you put the organization's well-being ahead of your patients or your stakeholders' well-being, lack of integrity, and lack of transparent communication. And I did see that in the questions that came in during registration that was an issue that one organization in our audience was having. And so by being intentional about your program design, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, you can actually bake capacity building into your business model, and it integrates your business model with your logic model. And reorients people to and communities to what is valuable. And I think I'll skip over this, but in the resources, you'll have a handout on this case study from Harvard about how independent bookstores were able to survive through disruption of Amazon through their development of social capital, becoming a community resource and really trying to make connections among their clients and giving people a sense of belonging to the community. And unfortunately, because our financial training and acculturation has really taught us to look at everything from an economic lens, sometimes we see these sources of social capital, such as employees and other stakeholders, maybe as a cost center instead of a capability and a resource and a valuable person. And so it's important, the social accounting model offers a way to make sure that all the resources that are needed for a successful organization are accounted for. And so we saw with the dental center that that took 7 years, so they looked like an overnight success in the clinic, the COVID era, but it was really all these years of hard work ahead of time. And it created some cultural shifts that the for-profit dentists originally had been a little bit on the fence and not supportive. And during the pandemic, they started to see the network benefits of being connected and supporting the clinic being open, and that it could help with some of their emergency services. Local funders initially may not have felt that there was a need to be investing in this, but as the events unfolded, they really did come to see that the dental clinic was central to the community, and provided financial investments to help it come through. And then ultimately, as we heard Jeanne saw, it was so successful that it's actually created geographic expansion where it's able to serve more places by going into these other communities. So for that, we will take a break and hand it over to Dana and Wade.
Some really interesting questions that came in as part of the registration when folks registered for the session. And it is interesting because we talked about this before the webinar, where so many of us are from a finance background. And so we like to try to integrate that financial storytelling with this. And it's not necessarily, they don't necessarily speak in the same language, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the fact that this is an asset that an organization possesses, and how best can we communicate that? You know, it's not necessarily something that we can put a dollar value on, but it is something we want to be able to tell as part of our story. And so really that quantification, not necessarily through dollars, but through other methods, how might you speak to that?
So there are a lot of ways to measure it. Sometimes social network analysis, where people do a mapping of their stakeholders and they can provide a visual depiction of it. And for quantities, things like Net Promoter Score, where you're tracking social media likes and engagement, to understand the breadth of the reach of your messaging, the depth, how many repeat interactions are you having with people. And those kind of metrics, and volunteer engagement the same way. So if you think about whatever group of stakeholders that are important for you to have relationship with, thinking about metrics that would capture the breadth, the depth, and the diversity of the network engagement. And again, the diversity is a really key piece, because by having diverse networks, you have more sources of information. You can triangulate it in different ways, get different perspectives. And so diversity should be a metric in anybody's social capital wheelhouse.
Yeah, and such a discussion as well. A great question that came in is, how could we think about this sort of like an in-kind contribution? And, you know, when we're thinking about leverage grant funding, and again, you know, I think that's far down the road in terms of the discussion and getting to that point, but it was another point that was brought up.
You know, I think it's interesting because this has been it's been an interesting process for me to think about. I do tend to think about, I do tend to be comfortable in more amorphous situations. And so when you're comfortable in relatively amorphous situations, you're just kind of keeping your eye on everything all the time. And I think a lot of nonprofit leaders are like that. You have to know what's going on politically, locally, and nationally, and amongst funders. Are they funding this or that right now? Amongst your own donors, do they feel pressed by something else to donate to another issue? And you're kind of keeping your eye on a lot of balls at one time. And the same is true about your stakeholders. For nonprofits, our stakeholder groups are wide and many if we allow them to be. We may be part of a national grouping of like organizations that may be all focused on low-income housing. Or we might be a part of a group of BIPOC-led organizations and get informed by that. All of these, you know, kind of pieces of our identity are points of contact with people who could potentially come in around us and help us if we allow them to see themselves in our world. And a lot of that really has to do, I mean, I think that Elizabeth talked about the reciprocity thing. Oh, there's a lot in here also about integrity. If people know that you have a common set of beliefs and that you value the same things in a real way that they do, they will make common cause with you because it does them good as well as it does you good. So trying to quantify that sometimes in what we know are very unpredictable situations is kind of hard. I just put in the what do you call it, in the chat, that my experience with a story like this was I was running a small actually, I was a volunteer in a small domestic violence organization when it had 90% of its funding withdrawn because the feds closed down LEAA, which was the agency that funded it at the federal level. We had to transfer every bit of our funding from that federal source to a local source. And to do that, we had to pull in every single person that we could pull in to advocate with us. So I think that what you find is that this is actually about knowing who you're with, what they're willing to do with you, and then being extremely agile and explorative in finding out what you can make of that. That really takes apart this idea of trying to nail down the exact value of a thing. You don't know the exact value of a thing until you can see that, oh my God, that's the one thing I need in order to make this happen.
And we're about to see that deploy in our next case study, talking about when disaster strikes, there you have that asset that's sort of lying there waiting for you.
Right.
Yeah. Elizabeth, you touched on it a bit about it's something that you can also easily lose. This is an asset whose intangible value can waste away. And one of the questions that came in our registration was clearly someone who has dealt with a weakening social capital for their organization that they're working on having to rebuild. And they're asking about some strategies to regain that lost capital. Maybe your reputation in the community, your credibility. Any words of wisdom on that?
Well, this is where I think transparency and candor do go a long way, because you can't change what happened. It already happened. The ship sailed, but you can own it. And if it's new people coming in, not throw other people under the bus, but say that we recognize what the issues were, and these are the steps that we've taken to do it. We realize we fell short. And this is our game plan going forward, and then asking, for the community's input, what do you think we should do? And soliciting that feedback, I think, can go a long way. And then if it's really egregious, making space for people to vent their grievances, and having some sort of healing session or listening session where you really try to understand their perspectives and how the organization got so off track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so precarious, that position. One quick final question before we go to our case study. The proceduralization of this within an organization, a question that we got in the registration was, who should be responsible for tracking and growing and managing social capital? And so I love these questions because it's all about how can I do this? And so it's a great point. Where in the organization would this live?
Well, everywhere. It really should, because everyone in an organization is in relationship with someone, right? So if you're the accountant, you're in relationship with your vendors and your procurement and your contractors. If you're in volunteer manager, in relationship with your volunteers, of your outreach and programming, certainly your clients and your constituents, but then also donors and internal administrative funders, professional association networks. And so social capital should be on the minds of every part of the organization. And then tracking it in what way makes sense to integrate it into their performance management. And I don't just mean, human resources performance management, but organizational performance management. And so the other, beauty of this model is that there are ways that you can bake it into your business model and your programming, connecting your logic and your business model, and end up where it's a lot easier to manage your programs because you're looking at these multiple dimensions of success, which are fundamental to your long-term viability. And if everybody's speaking the same language, understanding that relationships are a source of value, it can really be a way to help build shared understanding and then communicate that with your stakeholders as well.
Great. Thank you so much.
I think this is going back to Jeanne's story about the dental clinic. Oh, that was such an incredible story because they ended up their most powerful advocates at the point that they were facing the pandemic were the very people who had kind of resisted the organization when it was in its development phase. And it was very evolutionary. The ideas of, do we have common cause? What is that? Where can we begin to develop the trust it takes to make a new understanding of what this community altogether is? And that's where you have to be. And that takes everybody understanding that, in fact, we are not internal facing organizations. We are external facing organizations. And we should be all about the best interests of our communities, not about ourselves. And you actually have to be in that place to be able to do this properly. You can't just be looking for the best interests of your community, because then you won't be exploring those boundaries at which those resources actually exist in arm's length.
Thanks, Ruth. I'm Wade Rogers. I'm one of your moderators with the Commons, and I also happen to live in Asheville, North Carolina. You may be aware of the devastation that has visited our region. Actually, on September 27th was when Tropical Storm Helene passed through the area. And out of that has emerged a very compelling story of capitalizing on our social capital. So I have with me Stephanie Moore, who's the executive director of the Center for Craft here in Asheville, a nationally based organization that's rooted here in Western North Carolina. And this is a very timely story about how the center has deployed its social capital to help our craft community, and by extension, our community at large, through its Craft Futures Fund, weather this difficult period. So Stephanie, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad you accepted our invitation.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and I wonder if, I hate to use that term elevator speech, but I wonder if we could just have a quick elevator speech about the Center for Craft, but also it's so interesting about the national versus regional footprint that the center has. I wonder if you could tell us more about that.
Sure. So the center was created almost 30 years ago, and we were initially tucked in a very remote location about 30 miles south of where we are today, which is right in the middle of downtown Asheville. At the time, there was a lot of aspiration to create a field for craft. Many people my age and even before that, when they went to art history classes, they learned about artists. But the field of craft and craft writ large was fairly neglected in terms of scholarship and recognition of the artists. And so a small group of people came together and determined that craft mattered, its history mattered, its artists mattered. And that mission to advance the understanding of craft and what it means evolved to a new mission, which is to resource, catalyze, and amplify how and why craft matters. And so as the organization evolved over those 3 decades, it was convening leaders and scholars and artists from across the country, oftentimes about what the field needed to be relevant to both art and the context of craft. Sometimes it took smaller sessions about what curators in craft needed, talked about apprenticeships and how they were evolving in the field. But all with the goal of convening people in space and creating those relationships over a period of time. And so right now you see the slide, the Craft Futures Fund. One of the funds, we are a grant-making organization. We've given out close to $500,000 over the course of our lifetime. And we created a fund during the pandemic, which was called the Craft Futures Fund. It was an emergency relief grant to get artists back into the community using craft, which we know is a healing tool and a tool to connect one another, and gave them unrestricted cash awards. And so we've reactivated this fund in the immediate wake of Helene, and are giving initially $500 out to craft artists in the region of Western North Carolina. This is a picture of the River Arts District, which had over 300 studios and lives impacted, a majority of which were craft, completely flooded. And when you drove over the bridge to the left there, all you saw were a few small rooftops and that smokestack, which was historically the textile district of the region. And so, that devastation in our backyard immediately rose to the top of our minds. We shut down all of our national and local programs and focused on the reactivation of this fund, and have been giving grants since that started in September. So,
and I think the fund now is up to we're well into the 7-digit field now.
That's right. That's right. We had an initial seed funder, someone completely unknown to us, gave $250,000 to seed the fund. They were a foundation, someone who was involved in craft that really understood craft's value and seeded the fund. And now it's at 1.1 million, and we haven't even really launched a press effort. I know that one of the questions that came was, how does social capital and marketing work in tandem? Well, the center has never had a robust marketing arm. I think our annual marketing budget is under $3,000 a year, and yet word of mouth and just the spread of the organization's purpose has always risen to the occasion. So
I think that's what's so interesting. And by the way, I did hear about the fund on the radio this morning driving in.
Oh, good.
So yes, it's just going crazy.
Yes.
But what you said about that funder that came in, that seed funder, you didn't really know them. And Ruth has talked about it makes the invisible visible. The fact that there they were in the background, ready to be there to help. And I think you're seeing that with the other funds that are coming in, sort of unexpected sources.
That's right. I mean, I would say a majority of the individual donors are unknown to us. It is the occasion where, we often don't ask. And so when we do ask, I think this was timely, and that this support is so urgent and so necessary. It's almost, if your lives are connected or you are connected to Western North Carolina, you want to do something. And so both the board and the staff were engaged in an online fundraiser, which we'll probably do in the spring, but that was put on hold. And immediately, both the board and the staff started to think about this fund and how we could reactivate it and get the word out as quickly as possible. So not only donors could respond, but artists could start getting the relief they needed.
And interestingly, because of how quickly you launched this fund, like you said, there wasn't a huge marketing effort or a blitz, or it just happened. It spread through that network of folks who were there for the center.
That's right. And largely because of social media, we created a few graphics, but in 2 weeks, we went from that initial 250,000 to the over 1 million that we have today. And, it was our board, which is nationally based, spreading the word. It was our grant recipients all over the country spreading the word, but mostly through social media.
Yeah. And I think having that national footprint that the center has built, because there is such an interesting model with the center, is that it's a nationally funded organization. Not much of your funding comes from the local sector other than individual donors. And so you had that to tap into, as well as the response locally. So it was just this kind of beautiful harmony of the two ways that came through.
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I know that Elizabeth has some remarks to make about sort of mapping the social capital of the center and how that worked so well to get this fund started.
Yes, I will get to that. But while I'm putting the slides up, Stephanie, I did want to ask one question that came through on the pre-registration questions. And that is, you started off as sort of a local organization, didn't you? And people are wondering, how did you get big, or how can they get big? And so can you maybe tell the story of how you made that leap? Because I think it's on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, we are not a huge organization. When I was hired, it was a staff of 2.5. We were part of the university system. We've since separated from the university system. But it was always about connecting craft across the country in one way or the other. The resources came later. We ended up purchasing our building debt-free in downtown Asheville. We now have a staff of 14 and galleries and a free library and other things that have been added. But all of that was due to the success of grants and individuals and foundations and partners that believed in the work that we do and why craft matters and why it is so important to society, especially today.
An amazing story, and finding kindred spirits, then people who really serve the passion, regardless of the mission, regardless of the geographic location, sounded like a real, and then doing a good job on the things that you set out to do initially. I saw that there, you were locally geographically based, but that your money is also national. And so the working and living spaces of local community craft artists, even though they were decimated by the storm, you were able to draw on that prior work and the network of support you had built and shared mission and passion. And people stepped up in the time of need. The other thing that was amazing to me about your story, Stephanie, the Center for Craft Story, is that you put your annual fund campaign on hold,
right,
in order to do this local thing. And I have to say, when I heard that initially, my first thought was, I don't think every organization would have made that decision.
Mm-hmm.
So can you maybe talk a little bit about how, what was the dialogue internally,
Mm-hmm.
and was it a back and forth, or how did that look?
Yeah, so we had envisioned and will launch eventually a program called Craft Watch, where we talk about the value of craft. We have some well-known speakers talk about craft. And then we had watch parties in other parts of the country, one based in California, one based in New York, and one based in DC. And what we realized is that the staff here and, myself included, were going through this immense trying time, and we needed to step side by side with our community, whereas those other places were not. And so the whole event by concept felt very tone deaf to our local community. And there was a decision at which both the board and staff came together and talked through, can we do this and have the fund to need be local? And ultimately it was, we really can't do this. Like it doesn't make sense to mix the immediate need here in the community with the national scope and the national need of the organization. And so really quickly we arrived at the same decision. And I think there was mourning on both sides. I think that it will be great to relaunch it at a time when it makes sense and when we're able to move forward. But we just really felt like to be there for the community and to do what we needed to do, we needed to shift courses fast. So.
And I see a big parallel with the dental case study, right? Is like keeping with the long term, the long game in mind. And yes, you could have the immediate win of your annual fund, but at what cost for being tone deaf and
right,
ignoring local needs? That would just really make people not think well of your organization in the long run. So kudos to you and commendable for that.
Thank you.
One of the first things to do then is to start thinking about in capitals, like, oh, I'm building relationships with these people, that's social capital. And resource that I'll point you to in the United States, there's a nonprofit organization called the Indiana Certified Public Accountants Association. They're nonprofit, and they put out a report that talks about how they build social capital. They identify and map their stakeholders and point the mutual value creation for each group, how the stakeholders bring value to the organization, how the organization brings value to the stakeholders. And so just looking at how other organizations who are already doing this type of social accounting can be really eye-opening, and you'll start to see yourself how you are in many ways doing this, maybe just not talking about it or reporting like that. And then there's tools where you can start taking inventory to look at your different forms of capital, the social, the political, the economic, and the reputational, and see how where you can start building from your strengths. And then identifying your stakeholders is really key. Like, have you looked at all the groups and constituents that you need to be in relationship with, and to what degree? Because different stakeholders maybe have different depths of relationship needs. And so being really intentional about that. And there are tools and templates that can help you systematically approach your stakeholders and start understanding their needs and perspectives. And then from my experience at the Balboa Park Cultural Partnership, which was a consortium of museums, they were able to grow their social capital through intentional program design, where they were building two types of capitals at once. So through a training program, they were building the intellectual capital of the participants, but they were also helping them get to know each other over time and start trusting them through repeated interactions. And this actually changed the trust level, where the museum stopped seeing themselves as competitors and started seeing new mental models. Before it was, if they go to your museum, they won't come to mine, kind of that scarcity. And then, oh, if we work together, maybe we can get programming where we have them come multiple times and they visit both of our organizations. So thinking more of the win-win approach. And then getting involved, as Jeanne and Ruth have said, about positioning yourself as a leader, where you're seen as a go-to resource. And part of this can do just by sharing knowledge and your understanding of the needs of your constituents. And that can be a way to build social and reputational capital with funders and other groups. And then, telling your story through this lens of multiple capitals, the impact you're creating, both at the organization and with your constituents, but also for society at large, the social cohesion that you're contributing to. And so in the handouts, we will have multiple diagrams of how different organizations are mapping their social capital and how they are converting it from one form to another.
Hi, Elizabeth. I don't think we have any urgent questions coming in through the chat, but I think some of what you've shared, all of you have shared, I think, and we heard a little bit of this in Stephanie's story, as well as the dental case study. I think it'd be, I think for those of us who are finance leads or who often interact with finance leads, I think we're hearing the messaging around social capital being regenerative, potentially reciprocal, and also being based in integrity. But I think there was a very real example that Jeanne included. And I think, again, Stephanie's example of putting the annual fund on pause, or the example that was raised around maintaining full salaries and benefits and having to spend down reserves, and being in those really financially scary instances, could, again, I think represent instances where the maintenance and generation of social capital can feel challenging, particularly from a strictly financial perspective. So for those of us who are finance leads or who often interact with finance leads, can you just sort of revisit and maybe share some tips for making the case for how social capital is intricately linked to an organization's financial sustainability?
Well, a lot of it comes down to the information flow. So in understanding in terms of community needs is one thing. And so in the North Carolina case, we saw how they were very grassroots and had the information coming in, and the dental center listening to the stakeholders and constituents. And then also thinking in terms of the social determinants of health, so the broader long-term implications and what the clients really needed holistically in order to benefit and access the dental cases are examples. And so that's again where the diversity of the networks is important, because then it opens you up to receive information from different types of stakeholders. And then having a process such as Stephanie's board, where they can make sense of that and collate that information and try to figure out a way forward in line with the mission. is a really important process. So the governance and organizational structure are key as well.
Oh, Ruth, I think you're muted.
I want to talk about this a little bit because I think it's a very direct relationship between the deployment, the attraction in the moment, and the deployment of your social capital, and the money that then flows towards the organization. The urge is in a moment of crisis that either, Stephanie or Jeanne's story could have told us. In a moment of crisis, the urge is to devote some money to that crisis, to try to ease the pain, to try to, make something, heal something, right? And so people will want to do that. If they can find an organization that clearly has the trust of its constituency. In Stephanie's case, that was the craft artists and other people in that community. If they can find an agency that can clearly demonstrate that it has the trust of its constituency, they are going to put that money there because it's going to be a win for them in a high profile situation. I don't know how to explain it any other way. It's pretty straightforward. I know it isn't like 2 + 2 = 4. It isn't that at all. It is, if I put my faith in this thing that I had been building for years, and I feel like the relationship is strong, and I ask for that to be reciprocated in this moment, and my judgment is right, then it's almost, I hate to say it's a sure thing, but you can see these big leaps of organizations that go through those periods. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's not. And you never want to assume anything. And this means that you have to judge your own relationships properly. But it also means that if you want to make use of that again, you are going to treasure those relationships in your community and treat them as much or more treasure as any dollar bill that someone might throw in your direction, because it does regenerate. It's a different kind of resource, but it actually, the fact that this story is so common, and that we can look at organizations who are sitting in situations of crisis and see what they make of that in a kind of a counter-cyclical way, over and over and over again, means that we need to pay attention to it as a financial endeavor. I see you nodding, Stephanie. I don't know if you want to add to that at all. It is a matter of faith. It is a point of faith, but it's also something else.
Yes, I mean, I would say that what resonates with me, I mean, this is an entirely new concept to me, but what resonates is when you put the needs of your constituents above the organization. That seems to be what helps you build that social capital. And I would say that that has been the case, at least during my tenure. And the more you do that, the more you understand which direction you're intended to go, I should say.
And the amount of money that's come towards the Center for Craft is just, it's almost mind-boggling. Yeah,
I did have several people say we would never get there, and to have gotten there in 2 weeks feels very, very good. And at the same time, what North Carolina is facing is roughly a $53 billion loss. So we have a long way to go and a long time to get there. But it does feel good that we were able to jump in and within a relatively short amount of time, use that social capital to bring relief almost immediately.
Right.
And I think that is, the key takeaway, like Ruth said, across all these cases, right, is that at the end of the day, it is people rolling up their sleeves and working together to get something done, this shared vision, whether it be disaster recovery or, creating something like the Center of Craft for Craft to begin with, or the Dental Access Center, imagining something out of nothing through the shared vision. And, to Ruth, the term that comes to mind for me is really if you're doing the math, what it is a recipe for having 1 + 1 = 3. And it's the generation of cooperative surplus through this social capital and working together cooperatively. Jeanne, something that she said that struck me was the importance of, not having to agree on everything, but coming to consensus and keeping the larger vision in mind, because you want to create that, get to 3, not just stick on your 1.
I want to address something here, which is always in the background of these situations, is people's aversion to risk and people's aversion to anything that you can't tie down with a strict strategic plan that says this is where I'm going to be 3 months from now. Sometimes you just can't work like that because that's not the way the world works. And so you have to work with what's around you. You have to work with your environment, your operating environment. And so for boards, that's a hard pill to swallow. They have a fiduciary responsibility to take care of that organization and not to waste anybody's money. So making the decision that, we're going to pay people full-time salaries and their benefits and not lay anybody off during a period where you cannot use those people, it's an expression of faith by the board that is really extraordinary, and many boards may not be there. It may be more of a struggle. I put an experience I had with a small domestic violence program that lost all of its funding really immediately, and in that case, literally half the board resigned at the point that we decided we were gonna really make the effort to stay alive. And they resigned on the basis of it's not responsible financially to go forward. That organization is still there, and it's been 30 years. And it's actually made huge strides just during that 6-month period. So it is a calculation, but it is not a strict financial calculation. It is a calculation based on what you know about your constituency, your community, and your stakeholders. And it's art more than anything else. It's touch. But it actually has huge recompense. I wish we could describe it better, and I'm sure at some point we'll be able to, but I have to say, listening to stories like the Center for Craft and the Dental Center, it helps to really understand that there is a pattern here. And we need to pay more attention to the incredible skill that people bring to making those patterns work financially.
Fantastic. And agreed, 110%. So Elizabeth and Ruth, thank you so much for your thoughts, your philosophies, and your approach around this. Stephanie, thank you so incredibly much for being here and for sharing your story. I am going to hand it off to Amanda to wrap us up.
Thank you, Dana. And thank you to all of our presenters today. Elizabeth, thank you for walking us through social capital and just going over the uniqueness of social capital and how it can help our organizations, especially in the time of trouble. And thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your story of how the Craft Center has used social capital to be able to survive in such a turbulent time. And to our moderators, Dana and Wade, thank you. And thank you, Wade, also Ruth, for just giving us the background on social capital. But if you're on the webinar still, you have any questions that did not get answered by our panelists today, or questions that may come up later about social capital or any other topic, please head over to our forum on our website.